Ready.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Good morning, and thank you for coming to this joint event hosted by OSU in conjunction with the audience from QRI. Today, we're very fortunate to have a keynote from Professor Lu Zhang. And then just for everyone's information, this is, for all purposes, it should be considered an event with external participants, so all the usual rules with external events does apply. Great. And then let me give a quick introduction, and then we'll have Lu take the floor and give his keynote speech to everybody. So, Lu has been one of the most important and influential researchers in the fields of, theoretical asset pricing as well as empirical asset pricing over the past 25 years. He is currently the John W. Galbraith Chair and Professor of Finance at the OSU Fisher College of Business. And he also serves as an associate editor for one of the most influential finance research journals in the field. And then he's also the founding president of the Macrofinance Society. So primarily, he has focused on asset pricing and linking asset prices to various economic and financial fields. And he is best known for the investment CAPM, which posits that the expected returns or the anomalous returns that different firms could generate are based primarily on the investment decisions made by the firm. And then these investment decisions at the firm level result from differences in characteristics across the firms, as well as a Q factor model, which is an extension to the conventional, single factor CAPM model, and then with the addition of several other factors that matter for pricing the cross-section of returns. And his doctoral work on the value premium also earned the very prestigious Smith-Breeden Award in 2005. So really where his research has mattered the most for our applications in industry is that he has really given us a set of important tools for understanding what factors work when we invest across different asset classes and why these factors could work. So today he'll be speaking to us about a broader philosophical approach to thinking about how we can extract out certain reasoning or certain investment ideas for which factors work across the long term, and how we can approach this in a completely new setting that is completely independent from a lot of the prior economic work that you have seen based on Walrasian type theory. So this seminar will last for a total of 1 hour. And then afterwards, we'll have overflow time in case you want to ask questions. And then also, if during the talk you have some questions, please feel free to add them in the chat box, and then we will be able to address them after he concludes his prepared remarks. So without any further ado, please take it away, Lu. The floor is all yours.
All right. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's it's a pleasure for me to present in front of this prestigious audience. So this talk is still just going to be a progress report on a book I'm writing. I've been developing some ideas. I've already spent 4.5 years, and as you will see, I still have an immense amount of work ahead of me. So I've been working on asset pricing anomalies for the past 25 years, mostly from the rational perspective, but I have finally convinced myself anomalies are actually fatal to rational expectations. Things are actually much worse. Anomalies are fatal to the error equilibrium theory altogether. In its place, I've started to develop a process, alternative process theory with bounded rationality and the emergence. So the question I've been struggling for the past 4.5 years is as follows. What must the world be like for asset pricing anomalies to be possible? By asking what must the world be like, I am in effect doing natural philosophy. And I didn't start with philosophy. I started with technical economics. So here is the question. Here is an equation that is the organizing framework in our Q factor paper. So we were saying in equilibrium, supply and demand, right? So you have to intersect at the equilibrium point. So the traditional asset pricing theory that can go back to Lucas, for example, and many other people as well. So Lucas 1978, Lucas is saying if observed consumption data is from equilibrium, and I can throw my aggregate consumption directly into my consumption Euler equation, and that equation should give me equilibrium prices right away, right? So that's the consumption CAPM and the standard sharp Littner CAPM in our investments textbooks, is basically a special case of the consumption cap band, right? So cap band says that the only reason one security earns higher rates of returns than another security is only because the first security has a higher market beta. Okay, so but empirically, it has a lot of troubles. So over the past 25 years, and so my co-authors and I have put together what I call the investment cap band literature. So here is equation from our Q factor paper. We were saying, look, instead of looking at the investors, if you look at the firms, right, what the managers are actually doing, right? So the optimal capital budgeting, for example, and you can actually back out the implied expected return from observable investment policies and firm characteristics. So the numerator expected return, the numerator is just expected profitability. The denominator is investment costs. So this is how we get to our investment factor and the ROE, or return on equity factor, right? So that's theory, and the equilibrium theory. Everything is elegant, simple, and perhaps even aesthetically pleasing. But in the data, we have a bigger problem. So every time, that's oftentimes in the case in science, right? Every time we make some progress, in this case, the investment cap band literature, we just open the door for more questions. Oftentimes the questions are broader and deeper, right? So the question arises that have been irritating me to no end. Charles Sanders Peirce says any scientific inquiry starts with the irritation of doubt, and this is my irritation. This has become my obsession in the past 4.5 years, will continue to be so for a considerable future. So this is the irritation. This is our problem, right? So in the data, we know the CAPM doesn't work. The consumption CAPM doesn't work, right? We have half a century long evidence on the anomalous literature, more than half a century. The first paper is Bowen Brown, 1967, Journal of Accounting Research. And a lot of the factors that you've been working with, these are all based on anomaly evidence, right? The failure of the CAPM. So, but why would the supply side work, but not the demand side? In equilibrium, both sides have to work, right? So why? So this is what I call the hard problem of asset pricing. So even after like 20, 30 years of working in this field, this question has never gained much traction. And in fact, the problem is actually deeper, much bigger than asset pricing, because the consumption CAPM is a key building block in quantitative macroeconomics, in dynamic stochastic general equilibrium theory, right? It's a paragon of equilibrium theory. Well, as in empirical asset pricing, as you all know, right, one of the sorry, at the risk of sounding self-important, right, the empirical asset pricing is, I think, objectively one of the most developed fields in empirical economics, right? So we have, right, looking at our industry impact, right, investment professionals are indeed using our research. The fact that our practice and the standard theory don't seem to get along, it's a big problem, right? So I may as well call the problem a hard problem of economic science, and I will show shortly. So this is actually a hard problem of natural philosophy. So, but let me stay within my own field of asset pricing in order to do a bit of a naturalistic philosophy. Okay, so I'm asking, is there a theory of everything that can integrate, if not unify, our diverse research programs, right? So these are all the things that as an observer of capital markets, you will know these are our experience. You cannot deny every single one of them, right? So, and let me start with behavioral economics, right? So Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and slow, system one, system two investors are boundedly rational, right? So we don't have a God's eye view. We live within space-time. We're not outside space-time, right? The correspondence theory of truth is too naive. So we don't know the truth. We have to practice, right? So American pragmatism, right? So, and early on, Herb Simon and Gerd Gigerenzer as well, and household finance literature, the evidence is pretty convincing. There's no debate as far as empirical evidence is concerned, right? And I already mentioned the investment cap band at the cross-section of firms, and our economic model seems to be doing pretty well in the Q factor model, and It's not perfect, but relative to the traditional model, we do much better on the empirical front, right? So the consumption CAPM, even though in the cross section is much maligned, but keep in mind the consumption CAPM is indeed a good start for us to understand the stock market behavior. So we have three workhorse models in macro finance and time varying risk aversion, long run risk, and the risk barrier disasters models, right? So they do capture some elements of causal mechanisms in the stock market behavior. So, but how do you reconcile all these seemingly conflicting evidence, right? So why would the consumption CAPM seems to be doing fine in the aggregate, but fail in the cross section? As a result, our workhorse asset pricing models empirically are based on firm characteristics, right? All our factors that you are using. So these are all based on firm characteristics. The question is why, right? So finally, let me mention the classic Grossman-Stiglitz paradox. This is their famous 1980 AER paper. So their argument is that, look, markets cannot be in perfect equilibrium, cannot be perfectly efficient, right? So if market is perfectly efficient and then prices have impounded all the information out there, there's zero incentives to active managers to come in and do their work, right? So the fact that there are active managers doing their work and therefore market cannot be perfectly efficient, cannot be perfectly equilibrium, right? The flip side, which I totally agree, the flip side of that argument is that yes, active management is a big field. On the other hand, it's pretty difficult for active managers to outperform. You don't need me to tell you how competitive, how hard, how challenging your job really is, right? So you're competing with the other companies who employ highly trained, highly educated professionals. They have a lot of experience, so it's really difficult to outperform. So all these different experiences from our capital markets, right? So how do we reconcile? How do we form a coherent causal model of the world, right? How do we make sense of things? And that's a job of philosophy. So I'm going to answer yes in the affirmative that there is a theory of everything that we can reconcile these things. And I call that process theory. All right. So in the rest of the presentation, I'm going to first make the metaphysical philosophical assumptions underlying our standard theory perfectly clear. So I call them Walrasianism, right? So these are all the assumptions we're making in the standard model, and I'm gonna have a debate about them, and I'm gonna end up rejecting them altogether, all right? And then I'm gonna do a backpropagation to use a deep learning metaphor. So it's like if Walrasian model is as bad as I realize it now, right? So what was I thinking, and what was everybody else thinking? What was Walras thinking, right? So I'm gonna chase it all the way back to Walras 1874. Walras was following René Descartes, 1637. Discourse on the method, right? That Descartes was revolting against Aristotle, and Aristotle was fighting ancient Epicurean atomism, Democritus, Epicurus, and Lucretius, right? The atomists were following Parmenides, right? So that's the bottom of my back propagation. And then Parmenides had the intellectual enemy as well. That's Heraclitus, right? So that's the first process philosopher. And then after that, I'm going to do a front propagation and chase all the way down to current literature, being versus becoming. And finally, I'm going to start to put some basic elements of a process theory together to replace the standard Walrasian theory. So at this point, they basically pick up organizing principles and replacing the standard philosophical assumptions in the standard model with a new set of philosophical assumptions. All right, so let's go. Right, so the Walrasianism is my terminology for the worldview underlying the standard theory descended from Walras, 1874, Elements of Pure Economics, right? A worldview consists of ontology, epistemology, and methodology, right? So the first assumption, by the way, so this assumption, these statements are not empirically validated facts, right? So they are not empirical observations, right? So they are assumptions. They are not even results out of our theoretical models. They are the starting points. They are the assumptions on which we construct our models, all right? So the first one is basically ontological individualism or methodological individualism, right? So society is only consists of individuals, oftentimes isolated. Only investors price assets. They set the discount rate for firms, right? So in your MBA curriculum, for example, right? So we, in corporate finance classes, we teach students to do capital budgeting, choose financing policy, optimal capital structure, right? And then accounting courses do accounting valuation as well. But when it comes to discount rate, and that's an input. Well, do you go get the discount rate? And we tell students to go take an investments class. Oftentimes we say, all right, go run a multi-factor regression, right? So, so the underlying assumption about how the world works is that the investors are setting discount rates and firms are basically taking orders from investors, right? So, and that goes back to Vara's individualism starting point. And in equilibrium, it's also just sufficient to look at only investors, right? If the world is always in equilibrium, let me invoke Lucas again, right? Lucas says, right, if my consumption data is equilibrium quantities, I can throw that into my consumption cap band. The consumption cap band will give me equilibrium prices right away, right? And firms can do whatever they want. At the end of the day, the consumption Euler equation has to satisfy, and therefore it's sufficient for me to only look at the consumption-based asset pricing. Okay, and that's a metaphysical belief because we're assuming not only we're assuming aggregation, we're also assuming equilibrium, right? So for a long time, people only complain about the aggregation. I finally realized equilibrium is actually a much deeper problem, right? The question arises very quickly. You look at everybody, right? So investors are heterogeneous. We're all very different people, right? We come up with our unique experiences. Our mind is not a camera just taking representation of the world. We actually interact with the world. Is inactivism, all right? Francisco Varela, right? So in cognitive science. So we are all very different people. We have beliefs, wealth, and these are all very different. So whose consumption Euler equation should you be looking at, right? So who's the marginal investor that has all the pricing power for a given asset? So in practice, we end up doing idealizing, which is totally fine. It's a standard practice in scientific modeling. But why did I raise my thumb? So I didn't do that. So that's interesting. So
I think it recognizes when you push your thumb up, and then it reads it as a gesture. Yeah.
Yeah, so sorry, I didn't do that. All right, so the representative agent, right? So this is just a way to get our thing started, right? So in Sharp-Lindner CAPM, so did something very isomorphically similar, right? So they assume homogeneous expectations. Everybody agrees with everybody. If that is true, you're gonna see very limited trading volume. So the assumption per se is clearly a deliberate distortion of reality, right? So, but the way to interpret these things is that the mechanism is real, but it's very important that we keep in mind that they're derived under a whole set of assumptions. The leap of faith is that the mechanism we worked out in our scientific models will continue to hold when the assumptions are violated in the real data, right? And that's the problem for the CAPM. It doesn't, right? The mechanism doesn't. Risk does matter, right? When Lehman Brothers went the belly up, everybody was running to the exit, right? So risk does matter. But what I'm going to be revolting against vehemently is that only risk matters because it's only one scientific model. There are different perspectives you can look at our complex reality, right? So that's a flat ontology as well. So once you figure out the right stochastic discount factor from macro finance, and then the right SDF should apply everywhere, right? So in the standard model, there's no difference between micro and the macro. So this directly descended from Newtonian mechanics that the Vara was following, right? From Newton's perspective, what's the difference between his apple and Jupiter? Nothing. The only difference is that their mass is different. Jupiter is just a gigantic apple as far as Newton is concerned. Analogously, in economics, what's the difference between an individual consumer and aggregate economy? Nothing. Only that you can freely aggregate their consumption data to get to the aggregate consumption. The aggregate economy behaves like gigantic individual, right? So this is aggregation. This is really, really, really wrong, right? So, but for a long time, we don't have any tools to get out of it. And even technically, it's incorrect, right? For Newtonian mechanics, mass is linear, but in economics, our utility function is nonlinear, right? And we know that the nonlinear function of a sum is not the sum of the nonlinear functions, right? So, but that's actually relatively minor. To get out of assumption, I have to look at the emergence, and that's a totally whole breed of a natural philosophy. So in this, let me keep pounding on the standard theory, right? So then there we have achieved some success in macro finance, we go on to say, right? So this argument has been very prominent since 2001, SDFism. This is what I call SDFism, right? So we have the argument asset pricing is all about the pricing curve, know nothing but the stochastic discount factor, right? Therefore, the investment can ban because I abstract all the SDF away, right? Which I thought was like, very imaginative, creative device, and then, but I don't fit within the traditional SDF framework, right? So, and I have to revolt against it. So if the world is all about SDF, therefore, only risk matters. Keep in mind that once you assume oops. All right, so I should be careful not touching my mouse. So I keep getting weird signals up there. Okay, apology about that. All right, so basically, so what is saying is that, all right, so what was I thinking? So only risk matters. So right. So once you assume representative agent, right, the only thing left is the aggregate variables, right? So heterogeneity has been all thrown away, right? So only risk matters. So the fact that you worry about your individual risk only to the extent that it affects the market variance. So therefore, only risk matters, and therefore you have our academic leaders saying SMB and natural amount must be risk factors, and therefore there's also rational expectations, which turns out to be just an equilibrium condition for investor beliefs, in the sense that if we only work with the representative agent, the top-down approach, right, it's only a short distance from imposing the subjective beliefs. If everybody has the same subjective beliefs, it's only a small distance. And then why not you just go ahead and say that subjective belief is the objective distribution? That's rational expectations. So it's a matter of Occam's razor. All right, so let me stay away from my mouse. All right. All right, so that's the Walrasianism. Let me go ahead and start to pick it apart. All right, so the investment capital literature is the new kid on the block, and we get bullied all the time. So I'm facing all kinds of debates. All right, so fighting the establishment is a lot of fun, but that doesn't mean it's easy. All right, so I'm gonna highlight the micro reductionism, macro reductionism, and equilibrium. So these are the core assumptions underlying the standard model. One more time, these are assumptions. These are not the results. These are not the empirically observed facts. All right. The question is whether there exists an alternative big picture theory, alternative natural philosophy with a different set of assumptions that are closer to the truth. All right. So that's the issue I'm struggling with. Right. So micro reductionism. So in the standard theory, equilibrium theory, right? So this rational choice theory. So individuals are basically just atoms, social atoms. We're isolated, we do our own thing, we never change fixed utility functions. We look at the prices, we calculate them. Budget constraint, that's about it, right? There are no social structures. Companies are basically Lucas trees within our standard model. No institutions, and there's no time, right? In Newtonian mechanics, you can play the solar system evolution backwards and forward and backwards. You won't tell the difference, right? So not a whole lot of difference. But if you look at the your life review, right? You were born, you grow up, teenager, and then young adult, and then we grow old. So that no one will confuse the direction of time. The economy has an arrow of time, but that's not in the standard theory. And finally, only investors price assets, and that's really methodological individualism or anthropocentrism. It's like Ptolemy model. We put ourselves at the center of everything, including asset pricing. Therefore, firms are completely passive. They have zero pricing powers of their own asset prices. right? So but in sociology, that's clearly not true, right? The difference between psychology and sociology is that psychology studies minds. Sociology studies social structures. Of course, they are interactive, right? So what's the relation between individuals and society, right? In social theory, it's a long-standing debate ranging, at least since Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, right? So there's a lot of interaction between human agency and social structure. In particular, social structures that do exist. They are real. This is a Eleatic principle from Plato's Sophist, right? So basically, Eleatic principle says that an entity exists if and only if it has causal powers, can cause changes, right? Culture is real. We cannot see it, we cannot touch it, we cannot smell it, but culture obviously impact on our behavior, right? It's informal social norms. After a while, we get to learn, we get to adapt. Right? So if we do adapt to our culture, we're gonna be more productive. So social structures are clearly real. Firms are clearly real. So, but this deeply ingrained individualism is really quite hard to challenge in our standard model. And I've spent way too much time on Facebook. So this is a Facebook friend of mine. He's a philosopher, and his account that goes by the name Philosopher Games. So let me do a shout out. I'm using one of his memes. So you're a philosopher. You take a hike in a national park, and a tiger jumps in front of you. So how do you survive an actual tiger attack? Well, don't worry. You can remind yourself, you're a philosopher, you're sophisticated. You can just say, the tiger is just a bag of atoms, right? So if the tiger tries to eat you, remember, you're also a bag of atoms. The tiger is simply trying to help you rearrange your atoms for you. But obviously, that kind of a micro-reductionism is absurd, right? So because the tiger is real, so are you. You have causal powers. Your 86 billion neurons are going to have formed all kinds of synapses out of your experience, right? And you have consciousness, you can control your mind, can control your body, you can do the work, you can have positive impact on society. You are real, you do exist. So analogously, so basically this means, so free will does exist. We're just not a bunch of atoms bumping around. Our cells are all self-organized. We have top-down causation. We control our bodies, right? So most of the time. Right. So analogously in society is not just isolated individuals. Social structures are real. Companies are real, right? So we work for a company. I'm working for a university. I'm part of the university. So the university has some constraints over me, and which I'm happy to accept. So micro-reductionism is wrong. So now let me get to macro-reductionism. This is the notorious segregation problem, right? So why do we work with the representative agent? So you can chase it all the way back to Keynes, right? So Keynes is such a genius. He was not worried about the he was writing during the Great Depression, and he wants to get to the policy remedies right away. He's working with aggregate consumption, aggregate investment, the inflation, unemployment directly, right? So he's not worried about the rigorous micro foundation. People didn't have the tools back then. Lucas wants a micro foundation. He has a Lucas critique. However, so we should be very clear is that the representative agent is not the micro foundation to the original Austrian sense, Austrian economics, right? This is not the Mises and Hayek, Karl Menger Austrian micro foundation. So in effect, right, the SDFism, right? So let me invoke Laplace's demon in history of science. Laplace, this 1804, right? So he was working out the Bayesian probability. So he's saying if the world is a clockwork universe, like a machine, like what Newton says it is, right? So, and then super intelligence can just look at all the positions and the velocities of all the atoms in the universe and figure out the infinite future, and you can backpedal all the way to the past, right? So that's Laplace's demon. Right. So analogously, because our standard model is basically Newtonian equilibrium theory, Newtonian mechanics. So analogously, we have a Lucas demon. So this should be considered as humorous, and or at one point I thought about putting my own name in front of the demon, so I don't think I'm qualified. So I'm gonna continue to give credit or blame, for that matter, to Lucas, because because we're all following Lucas 1978, right? When you think about it, right? So what Lucas has done to asset pricing, it's kind of intellectual carnage. Right. So basically, what the Lucas demon is saying is that look at SDF, right? The demon's SDF will price everything, right? So there are no differences. So S&P, cross section of returns, corporate bonds, government bonds, derivatives, foreign exchange, everything, right? Hedge funds, private equity, emerging markets, you name it. So we're supposed to find that super intelligent investor, could be a financial intermediary, and then that can price everything, right? So this is just wrong. This is just right. So in practice, we know that different investors. So these are different spaces, right? So Hayek says our knowledge is dispersed, right? The economy is a bottom-up coordination problem, not the top-down control problem a super intelligent investor can solve. So in other words, what we have done is like we are taking a shortcut in macro, but we're treating it as like truth in finance. So in macro, it's probably not unreasonable given the technological constraints, right? So adjacent possibles were pretty limited back in the 70s and 80s when Lucas, Prescott, and Kittlin started to do quantitative macro, right? So, but it's very important. It's a shortcut, right? So in macro, it's probably still okay because you have all this philosophers call underdetermination of theory by data. Is really hard to tell, especially, I was reading during the financial crisis. I was reading Paul Krugman's writings. I was listening to George Soros at the time. It's not clear what alternative macro theory will look like. On top of that, right, so we have identification problem, right? So it's but now we do now. I'm a macro is my very expensive hobby. I've spent a lot of time doing macro as well. But I'm primarily an asset pricer. Anomalies, it finally occurred to me. Anomalies are gigantic identification. It's practically screaming at me for 25 years. The standard model doesn't work, right? So this is identification. We cannot stick with the aggregation like forever, right? So, but once I start to dig into the literature, I realize I'm starting to have more appreciation how deep the problem really goes. So the micro-macro dichotomy is right in the heart of the mechanical philosophy. Okay, think about Rene Descartes' mind-body problem. Descartes says the world has two substances: res cogitans, our thinking as substance, our mind, and res extensa, extended substance. That's the world. To Descartes, mind and body are separate. Right. So, and the world follows has a limited change. The world does change around, but they all the changes follow mathematical laws of motion, laws of nature. So it's very predictable. So, but as the Princess Elizabeth was like, Descartes, how do the two substances interact, right? So how does the mind control the body and backwards? And Descartes didn't know. Right. So, and that problem is still with us today, as in the hard problem of consciousness. So, so I just made an analogy between hard problem of asset pricing and hard problem of consciousness. Deep down, they're all about the ontology, right? The micro-macro dichotomy is everywhere in modern philosophy and science. So, quantum gravity again. So, quantum mechanics work in microscopic realm. Einstein's general relativity working macroscopic. They don't get along. So again, the reality is layered, right? So you just like you cannot use general relativity to study quantum mechanics, you cannot impose consumption cap on the investment cap. We are literally looking at the two different layers of reality. Now the question arises, how do they interact? And that's my job, right? In the project, and still going. I still have an immense amount of work to do. Science wars as well, right? So CP Snow's two cultures, humanities and science and humanities don't get along, right? In the 1990s, you have science wars, right? So, and then analytical versus continental philosophy. So if the world is just a machine, if our human beings were just like a machine, except our minds, what's the meaning in life, right? If the world is everything is determined, the extendi, we're just following mechanical Newton's law of motion. What's the point of life, right? So this is clearly inadequate. So let me nail down, and all goes back to ontology, natural philosophy. So let me nail down the macro reductionism a little bit more. So this is Daniel Dennett, who passed away recently. Big fan of his work. So this is his 1995 Darwin's Dangerous Idea, right? So he talks about greedy reductionism, right? So when in their eagerness for bargain, in their zeal to explain too much to short, scientists, philosophers underestimate the complexities in the world and trying to skip a whole layers of reality in their rush to fasten everything securely and neatly to the foundation. So this is what my critique level that SDF is on, right? Asset pricing is not just about the pricing kernel. Pricing kernel is important, but it's a shortcut for us to look at the aggregate economy, right? The unification of scientific knowledge should be going in through integration, not eliminating a whole field. It's like Einstein Einstein never tried to eliminate quantum mechanics. He just tried to understand it better, right? Right. So even Einstein didn't say quantum mechanics didn't exist. Analogously, right? You cannot say investment CAPM is not the CAPM, it's not the asset pricing. It's absurd. All right, so now let me get to equilibrium. So this is the hardest core of a hardest core in standard theory. So I have no way to go but to look at this assumption, because in epistemology, there's coherentism. All the core beliefs, they actually cohere. They're all interconnected. I cannot change aggregation without changing the rest. They all go rise and fall together. All right, so when I was in school, growing up intellectually, I was practically sleeping with books like Musculon, Wisdom, Green, and the stocky Lucas with Prescott on my nightstand. The books, right? So, I mean, it's not like, so equilibrium is my worldview for a long time. It's never occurred to me that that as an economist, like I should turn around and question equilibrium altogether, right? So, I mean, this is the Sunshine mentality brew theorem is in Muscular Wisdom Green, right? It's chapter 17, right? So what the Sunshine mentality brew theorem says that even if everyone is well behaved, look at if every investor, every firm, right? So interior solution, concave utility function, convex budget constraint, even if everyone is well behaved, once you aggregate the economy up, the excess demand function is unrestricted, right? So you can prove existence. You cannot show uniqueness. There's no stability, right? So it's especially, there's no debate among micro theorists. This is well understood, right? Franklin Fisher, 1983 book talks about, right? So economy is part dependence. So if you, in our standard theory, we have a Walrasian auctioneer, right? So you have, but which only allows trades at the equilibrium prices. But in reality, when two traders start to transact their securities, right? If it's outside of equilibrium, right, they're going to be wealth effect. The equilibrium you are converging towards is not the original equilibrium anymore. So it's like, what do we do now? Smarty pants, right? So I remember when I read the study that started to appreciate the implications of all these theorems would mean, I was like, what do we do now? We have to get out of the bed, right? So we have to add the line. We have to work. We have to add the lines on our CV. You cannot go tell your dean we are philosophizing. We're going to maybe with some very small probability, we may just end up changing the world, right? So everybody will claim that it's not credible. Right. So what do we do now? So I was like, okay, fine. I was totally fine throwing in some assumptions following the lead of Lucas and Prescott, right? So representative agent, we ignore heterogeneity and more importantly, we ignore the process. We ignore the disequilibrium. So this Alan Kerman, for a long time, I read Kerman's writing as saying, all right, heterogeneity is important, but actually equilibrium is even more deeply embedded, right? Precisely we turn a messy coordination, bottom-up coordination problem into a top-down control problem. We can guarantee the existence of equilibrium, guarantee its uniqueness and stability, Therefore, we can do comparative statics. All right, that's how we developed the more the macro as well as the standard asset pricing theory, right? But it's really important to realize that aggregation is a gigantic assumption. And then, right, so a lot of colleagues, macro finance friends were like, Lou, you criticize representative agent. What about Croissant-Smith? I was like, what about Croissant-Smith? There's a reason Croissant-Smith method is called approximate aggregation, right? So, and I'm a producer of that literature myself. So every time my cross-sectional approximation, the R square falls below 99.9, in good conscience, I cannot write that paper, right? Because I haven't solved the model. There are too many errors, right? More than comfort zone, so I should stop, right? So, but as a consumer of that literature, we need to be very clear there's a big fire draw problem, right? So in Croissant-Smith economies, precisely because aggregation holds approximately, we still have equilibrium, but as a result, the economy behaves like a representative agent economy, all right? So again, Croissant-Smith, now I read back and I look back, I think the paper basically papered over the aggregation even further, right? So I actually started to think about more recently, right? So this is my recent work because I make my living in factors, right? So I have to deal with the heterogeneous firms, I have to deal with the representative agent, and then in Croissant-Smith economic theory, they have heterogeneous consumers, but one representative firm. I actually started to think about, hey, what's an equilibrium economy will look like with heterogeneous firms and heterogeneous consumers, and then all kind of nightmares start to come back to me. In the sense that I studied the McGill and Crinzy theory of incomplete markets in school, that basically there are no results. There are no results. Every time you introduce a new innovation, new security into the stock market, and then the whole equilibrium changes. There's no way you can trace the changes, right? So, and in fact, every fiber of my being, I mean every fiber of my becoming is screaming at me, I'm on the wrong track, right? So, and then I started, the irritation of doubt is becoming unbearable. I started to read extensively outside the equilibrium theory until I hit the Austrian economics, the socialist calculation debate. That's when I convinced myself equilibrium theory is profoundly wrong. We need to get out of it, right? So people can do whatever they want. As far as I'm concerned, I'm getting out of it, and you're never gonna see me writing down another equilibrium model, right? So this is a history of economic thought. Otto Neurath, right, worked in the War Department in Austria during World War I. He had good experience. He thought the planning was very efficient, right? He thought he could implement that to the whole national economy. So Ludwig von Mises was like, no, you cannot do that. You need the private equity. You need the private equity. You need the private properties to generate the market prices. You need the market prices to allocate scarce resource, right? That was 1921, and Oscar Lange came along. So intellectual debate goes on forever. Oscar Lange came along in 1936. So he says, all right, Mr. Mises was right. We do need the market prices. But look at your standard economic theory. All you have is a Walrasian equilibrium, which is a system of simultaneous equations, right? I can have my social planning board solve the equations for you, right? And then tell consumers what to buy, firms what to produce. And Hayek was like, went ballistic, right? So that's why he wrote his 1945 AER paper, the classic paper saying Lange is wrong, right? Our knowledge is dispersed, all the different investment space, like private equity, hedge funds, corporate bonds, they require a tremendous amount of investment in human capital. You have to learn the institutional structures, the underlying theory. The knowledge is not available more broadly. We all specialize, right? So this is what Hayek says. The data from which the economic calculus starts are never for the whole society given to a single mind, which could work out the implications that can never be so given. Now, what does that single mind remind you of? Right, Lucas' demon. The standard theory is profoundly wrong. Right, the standard asset pricing theory is profoundly wrong. We are converting a messy bottom-up coordination problem into a top-down control problem, and we're trying to impose consumption cap ban everywhere, saying asset pricing is all about the pricing kernel. That's just wrong. All right. So if the standard theory is as wrong as I think it is, so what was I thinking for so long, right? So I did well, not explicitly defending the consumption cap ban, but I didn't revolt it until very recently. So what was I thinking, right? So I've been running a back propagation in my own neural network in my brain, to use a deep learning metaphor. My explanatory gap is the hard problem of asset pricing, right? For a long time, my history of economic thought started in 1982. So when Kitted and Prescott published their, econometric paper and launched the quantitative macro, right? And we all know that our founding fathers in finance, Markowitz, Sharp, Littner, right? So derived the cap ban building on Markowitz and homogeneous expectations, and the economists absorb that, incorporate that into Arrow-Debreu framework by going further, right? Not just the homogeneous expectations. Sharply, that actually allow different risk aversion. You have two-founder separation, right? So economists, when they had to say representative agent, or everybody's literally all identical, everybody knows, and the consumption cap ban is part of the quantitative macro. Everybody knows macroeconomists was basically adapting Arrow-Debreu equilibrium theory, McKinsey as well. And everybody knows Arrow-Debreu McKinsey was providing a rigorous mathematical foundation for Wara, 1874, right? Equilibrium vision, right? I should mention Alfred Marshall. Marshall is an interesting figure, conflicted as well, right? Ambivalent the whole time. So Marshall wrote in his introduction, Principles of Economics, the mecca of economics is in economic biology, not in economic dynamics, by which he meant mechanics. But he went ahead and developed mechanics anyway, thereby solidify neoclassical economics. Till this day, most economists still think Wara is a better economist than Marshall. And Marshall keeps saying you need to look at partial equilibrium, Waresi, and general equilibrium is too unrealistic, but it doesn't matter. So I'm going to take the exact opposite. I think Marshall is a better economist than Wara, and I'm going to go even further than Marshall because we have the tools now. We have the distributed artificial intelligence. We have multi-agent systems in computer science. We can literally implement, right? Austrian economics, the original vision, okay? So now let me keep going. Let me push back the back propagation even further, right?
Hey Lou, just a quick time check. You have around 10 minutes, so if you wanted to, just prioritize.
I'm getting there. Thank you. Right. So what was Walras thinking? If equilibrium theory is a dead end, what was Walras thinking? Well, Walras was following mechanical philosophers at the time, right? You have during Walras' writing, right? Boltzmann was still just publishing articles pushing the probabilistic interpretation of second law of thermodynamics, and that law itself is derived by in 1850 by Rudolf Clausius, and Charles Darwin just published The Origin of Species in 1859, right? And later on, quantum mechanics developed in 1905, 1900, and then 1920s was way after Wara, and general relativity as well, right? So all these new developments in science, they were putting tremendous pressure on mechanical philosophy, but that pressure wasn't there, right? Wara hardly felt anything, so he went ahead and followed his fellow Frenchman, René Descartes and Pierre Cassindi. Descartes is a rationalist, Cassindi is an empiricist. That's just epistemology. When it comes to ontology, they are all mechanical philosophers. They see the world as a machine. Machine doesn't change, right? So the change is very limited, and they rebelled after Aristotle, but Aristotle actually has a good theory of change, matter and the form, right? So hylomorphism. So acorn will grow into an oak tree because acorn has the potentiality of being an oak tree, right? And that potentiality is one form of being, right? So, but the mechanical philosophers beat up Aristotle and they embraced Epicurus, Lucretius, atomism, right? So we're all social atoms according to Wara. That's what Walras was thinking, right? So but the atomists were following Parmenides, right? So being. So Parmenides was saying, what is, what is not, right? What is not doesn't exist. Therefore, it doesn't make any sense. to think about something that is not. So therefore, change is all an illusion, right? There's no change, equilibrium. What Walras end up doing is to develop the most radical social theory for Parmenides being, right? So natural philosophy. All right, so that's Parmenides. Parmenides as an intellectual opponent, that's Heraclitus. So Heraclitus was saying you cannot step into the same river twice. The water keeps flowing, and you are different as well, right? And Heraclitus saying river is a river precisely because water keeps flowing. If the water is not flowing, it's a pond, it's a lake. It's still changing, but it's a different process, right? So that's Heraclitus. So unfortunately, Aristotle knocked out the process theory for 2,000 years. So Aristotle's acorn growth into an oak tree. So Aristotle was talking about essence. Forms don't change, right? The unmoved mover, that's God. That's pure actuality, pure form, right? You have to wait until Romanticism. Friedrich Schelling, they're talking about right natural philosophy. So Schelling rebelled against Enlightenment, which was following Newton, right? Schelling was saying the world is not a machine, the world is an organism. You have to wait until Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, John Dewey, Alfred North Whitehead, and more recently Joe Deleuze and Ilya Prigogine. All these are process thinkers, but I guess Hayek was the economist. I can put up on this list, but in economics, not to say finance, right? Finance, we're all equilibrium theorists. There's very little representation for becoming, and I want to get on this list. All right, so let me start to put together. I only have a few slides left. So the world is processual, processes all the way down and all the way up, right? All the way down, think about particle physics. Deep down is a quantum field, different quantum fields. A particle is not the physical, it's not a substance, it's excitations of energy, right? Waves of potentiality, right? So quantum field theory is our boundary of science right now, right? So you can ask further, but I can only build on what we know right now. It's processes all the way up as well. Think about the cosmology. We have Big Bang theory now. I mean, it has a lot of problems more recently, but whichever way you look, I'm thinking about the Lee Smolin evolutionary cosmology. Whichever way you look, the world is not equilibrium. So in economy, we're right in the middle, right? So things change all the time. Think how much our lives have changed since ChatGPT showed up, right? So bounded ecological rationality. Right, so we don't have a God's eye view. Social structures are basically emergent processes. The invisible hand, Adam Smith, is not equilibrium. It's a spontaneous order that's sustained by churning in the market, right? So market process. This is very Hayekian, Van and Smithian. On the other hand, in the traditional behavioral finance efficient markets debate, I'm reframing that as chaos versus order. I'm still coming down on the side of order, but it's not scientism, it's not equilibrium. I'm going to say the markets are inefficiently efficient. So paraphrasing Winston Churchill, I'm going to say the market economy is the worst economic system except for all the others. Okay, that's all I meant by efficient markets. And then I'm going to be doubling down on the investment CAPM literature. I'm going to say firms are the primary causal powers of their own asset prices. So if you remember your corporate finance class from school, right? So this is what we teach, right? So this is the philosophical underlying for the capital budgeting, NP net present value rule, optimal financing policy. Firms clearly have a lot of causal powers on their own firm value, right? But if you take that literally, I'm using the same equations, right? The investment CAPM is a corporate finance model. I'm just looking at the returns, not open skew, right? So, but it's highly incompatible with the standard asset pricing theory. So I'm gonna double down. I'm gonna say investment CAPM literature is the Copernican revolution in finance, and that's the Ptolemy model. You have epicycle on top of epicycle. Ptolemy put the 150 AD, right? So they put the Earth at the center of the universe, and you have all kinds of problems retrograde. Mars periodically will move backwards, right? So that's retrograde. Ptolemy had to put a lot of epicycles on top of that. It's like epicycle on top of epicycle is like a time series, a Taylor series expansion. You get to approximate any movement, right? So Copernicus came along and put the sun at the center of the universe. So he said, no, it's a mathematical model. It's not just the instrument. We want to understand how the world really works, right? So he's a realist in that regard. And of course, this is a vastly simplified picture because Copernicus was still using epicycles at the end of the day. So analogously, I was saying, look, the Q factor model is much simpler, right? So relative to some of the competitors out there, they are really, they're trying to save the CAPM at the empirically motivated factors, although we are using the factor form, but at the end of the day, we are saying, the investment CAPM captures how the world really works, right? So I believe I have solved, at least conceptually, I have solved the hard problem of asset pricing. Okay, so it's so on ontology, I'm moving from mechanical philosophy to process philosophy. On epistemology, I'm moving from logical positivism to American pragmatism. On methodology, I'm moving from equilibrium theory to system theory. Right. So all because I started to mess with aggregation. But the second I go to emergence, which is the antithesis in philosophy against the linear aggregation, right? So suddenly the world is forever evolving, is perpetual novelty keeps popping up, right? Think about the biosphere. Social evolution happens even faster than biosphere, right? So I have to embrace ecological rationality because rational expectation doesn't work. It's like a Jimmy Savage's small world, the expected utility function, literally speaking, at the philosophical level, it actually doesn't work, right? So the last assumption to go is equilibrium. If the world is forever evolving, being is only temporary, right? So, so this process is real. Change is fundamental. Stability is just a change at a slower, at the longer time scale, right? If you look at the solar system, it looks stable only to our human time scale. In cosmic scale, it's evolving, right? So solar system has a beginning and has an end as well. So, all right, so I'm running out of time. So let me just, so basically that's what I was saying. So consumption CAPM and the investment CAPM are two different layers of reality. So they capture different causal structures. They can coexist. The broader, more general theory has to be a process theory. Okay, so let me conclude. Okay, all right. Despite my Wittgensteinian term in my intellectual work, and I wish to emphasize the continuity between the earlier Lu and the later Lu, right? So I continue to emphasize corporate actors are the primary causal powers of their own asset prices, not investors. In fact, I'm doubling down, right? So I'm escalating that the investment CAPM as the Copernican revolution in finance. And another continuity is that between chaos and order, I'm coming down, right? Even after I embrace behavioral economics, Herb Simon, Gigerenzer in particular, so I'm still coming down to order, spontaneous order, Adam Smith, Hayek, and Vernon Smith, right? So the markets are inefficiently efficient, right? I'm emphasizing efficiency more than inefficient, more than investors pragmatically have to make mistakes in order to learn, right? So, but on the other hand, I am rejecting scientism. Equilibrium theory anomalies are fatal to rational expectations, and equilibrium theory and supportive of a process theory with bounded rationality and the emergence. Sorry, I think I stayed within an hour, so that's all I prepared.